All right, hey there, comrades. This is episode 4 of our series on the political economy textbook written by the Academy of Sciences of the USSR. This episode is going to be focusing on monopoly capitalism. So this is imperialism, as we know it by Lenin's definition, the highest stage of capitalism. This part of the textbook takes mainly from the points that Vladimir Lenin makes in Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, but it also incorporates a lot of historical facts surrounding the findings, the scientific findings that Lenin made, as well as a bit of the history of the national liberation movement across the world, from anti-colonial movement, as well as some history of World War I and World War II. I'm not going to get too much into that. I'm going to get more into the definitions and the theoretical aspects of what we talk about, what we mean when we talk about imperialism and monopoly capitalism. So first, we have to talk about how imperialism emerged, right? It's a transit. It began out of capitalism that was not dominated by monopolies. Capitalism that was characterized by specifically free competition between individual capitalists and property and factory owners. Now, this pre-monopoly capitalism, it basically hit its apex of development in the 1860s and 1870s, and around that time, around the world, there was a transition to this imperial period. This period we also use synonymously, imperialism and monopoly capitalism, and that transitory period ended in the early 20th century. So let's talk a little bit about this notion of competition, because when we talk about monopoly capitalism or imperialism, it basically means the end of free competition in capitalism. This free competition is replaced with the condition of basically the world's markets being dominated by a small handful of capitalist monopolies. And one thing we have to understand, a lot of these terms, monopolies, competition, we have to understand them in the Marxist sense. We're going to go over them because they differ from the way, for example, bourgeois economists define words like monopoly, which basically means like dominance of one company. It doesn't necessarily mean that in Marxist political economy. Free competition, the definition of free competition differs with between bourgeois economists and Soviet and Marxist political economists. So when we talk about when we talk about the death of free competition in capitalism, we don't mean the death of competition. We have to understand that when capitalist society goes from having an economy in which, capitalist, generally smaller proprietors are competing with one another in a large economy, this is replaced by the domination of monopolies. But competition still goes on. It's just not free competition as was understood before the imperialist period. And there's really 3 things to understand about competition in monopoly capitalism. Competition does not stop inside monopolies. For example, members of these monopolies, they fight over the most profitable markets and the largest shares of the markets as well. But the thing is that they unite in competition against enterprises outside of the monopolies. And this basically gives companies inside monopolies an edge against these companies that are not within its monopoly. And that could mean individual proprietors, or it could mean other monopolies. That's another thing. Competition continues between monopolies as well. And the third point that I wanted to make about competition is what I just said about competition going on between monopolies and companies that are not within the purview of the monopoly in question. So I wanted to define a monopoly in political economy, because as I said, obviously, there's a difference between the way Marxist political economists understand this word and bourgeois economists. So does anyone who's on the call right now want to try and define a monopoly as was stated in the textbook? Want to give it a shot, Ryan?
Sure. I mean, thinking of monopoly, they have a monopoly over the means of production, and it's primarily with finance capital that they have this monopoly.
Yeah. I'm going to go into finance capital as well. Yeah, a little bit later. But basically, the textbook says it's an agreement or an alliance or an association between capitalists who concentrate in their hands the production and sale of a substantial part of the production of one or a number of branches in order to fix high prices for commodities and obtain monopolist high profits. Sometimes monopolies are individual, very large concerns which occupy a dominant position in a particular branch of industry. So that's basically like a general definition of what we mean by a monopoly, with all of the aspects combined into one definition. So it's an alliance of capitalists. They use their alliance to dominate branches of industry so that they can fix high monopoly prices and make monopoly profit, which is different from the kind of profit that capitalists were making in the pre-monopoly period, which we in political economy understand as average profit, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Some of the examples of monopolies that were given in the textbook, there's a number of them. I'm just going to go over some of them. There's like anything from like short-term agreements about selling prices that could be considered rings or corners or conventions, to larger, more longer-term alliances like cartels and syndicates and trusts. I'm going to define these because these are all actually a little bit different. Cartels are monopolistic alliances in which the partners agree on conditions of sale in terms of payment. They divide the markets among themselves and they decide the quantity of goods to be produced and at fixed prices that are of their determination. A syndicate is a monopoly organization in which the sale of goods and sometimes also the purchase of raw materials is effected through a common office. So this is a little bit different. And trusts, which I think are probably the most known form of monopoly, probably because everyone knows John Rockefeller and Standard Oil, and that was a combination of trusts. But a trust is a monopoly in which the ownership of all the enterprises is unified. Their owners have become shareholders who draw profit in accordance with the number of shares they hold. So basically, you know, this is just a joint stock company that dominates the market. That's what we mean when we're talking about trusts. And they often form these trusts a part of a wider union that in the textbook is defined as a concern. And a concern is an association of a number of enterprises in different branches of industry, commercial firms, banks, transport, insurance companies, based on common financial dependence on a particular group of very big capitalists. And this is also connected to what we're going to talk about with finance capital as well, but I'm going to get into that a little bit later. And it's also important to know that we have to interpret monopoly, like the definition, the Marxist definition of monopoly capitalism. We can't interpret it mechanically. It doesn't mean that there are only monopolies that control absolutely everything. That's not true. There's also medium and small enterprises that exist alongside these things. I mean, we see like small businesses still exist, but the whole thing is that the dominant role in the world economy, the world capitalist economy now, is played by these monopolies. And the possibility of like a small business being built from the ground up and becoming a monopoly in itself is like basically impossible. It's statistically impossible. I mean, we only hear about that in the small minority of cases in which this happens. Like, for example, like Bill Gates working in his garage, not going to college. I mean, that stuff is like a millionth of a percent a possibility that someone can build a business up like that under monopoly capitalist conditions. And the reason, bourgeois propaganda focuses on that is because they want to keep up the illusion that free competition still exists, because that's one of the appeals that capitalism is supposed to have, but it doesn't have that anymore. And, most people who start up small businesses either fail or their highest aspiration is to get bought out by a monopoly. That's really what success for a small businessman is these days. And that's because of the conditions of monopoly capitalism. Now, to give a little bit of historical context, it's important to understand that, this was all made possible by large-scale technological advances and the concentration of industry, which took place in the last third of the 19th century. In the middle of the 19th century, the predominant place of industry in capitalist countries was light industry. This is opposed to industrialization in socialist countries, where heavy industry comes first and then light industry. But in capitalist industrialization, we see light industry emerge first, heavy industry comes later. Numerous enterprises of comparatively small size belong to individual owners. This is what we mean by free competition. These individual owners with small capital holdings compete with one another. This is what existed in pre-monopoly capitalism. And the operation of the law of concentration and centralization of capital inevitably led to monopoly capitalism, because only after a certain period of time are you going to have winners in this period of free competition. And they're just going to, the more they win, the more likely they are going to be to win. And this is basically what continues to cause the concentration and centralization of capital to the level of monopolies. But there is a very specific historical epoch that basically marked the turning point of this, the turning point between from pre-monopoly capitalism to imperialism, that we don't really talk about that much in American schools. Usually, we hear all about the Great Depression in schools. Every American knows the Great Depression, but very few people actually know the Long Depression, which took place between 1873 and 1896. This was one of the worst global economic crises that ever took place, in the entire history of capitalism. And it was so destructive and so it was just such a deep crisis that it's through the collapse of the masses of businesses during this period and the extreme centralization of capital in the literally the 1% capitalist class that actually won out from this crisis. It was after this that heavy industry actually played the predominant role in the primary capitalist countries, and the spread of joint stock companies further centralized capital, and we saw the emergence of these giant monopolies, these this handful of companies that actually won out from the crisis, while the vast majority of people who were competing in the open markets went bankrupt. And so when we look at the end of this long depression, 1896, this is really where around the time where we can say that imperialism has become the capitalism had reached the imperialist stage. And the result of this transition to imperialism, we have to understand that there was a sharpening of the contradictions between the productive forces and the production relations of capitalism, meaning, yes, imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, and it's reached the highest concentration of wealth and these giant monopolies that can rule the world. But at the same time, it's actually marking capitalism's decay in another way. And we're going to talk about that a bit later as well. But this period is also, this transition to imperialism is also marked by production submission to the monopoly capitalists' hunt for maximum profit, which created barriers to the development of productive forces, because economic crises of overproduction occurred far more often. They began to, and their destructive force increased. Relative unemployment and poverty increased significantly, and this also led to an intensification of the global proletarian struggle, which we saw throughout the 20th century, of course, and is still going on today, although not as successfully as those times. So basically, this set up a situation in which a handful of capitalist countries, the capitalist powers of Europe and the US, took the world by force, in the form of enormous colonial possessions. And it also had the side effect of bringing the global means of production to a new level of socialization as well. Here, I also wanted to read out word for word Lenin's classical definition of imperialism that he wrote in Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, he writes, the concentration of production and capital developed to such a high stage that it created monopolies which play a decisive role in economic life. That's the first aspect. The second aspect is the merging of bank capital with industrial capital and the creation on this basis of financial capital, of a financial oligarchy. We're going to talk about that too. Number three, the export of capital. We're also going to talk about this, which has become extremely important as distinguished from the export of commodities, very different. And four, the formation of international capitalist monopolies, which share the world among themselves. And five, the territorial division of the whole world among the great capitalist powers is completed. So that's Lenin's definition straight from Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. So now I'm going to focus this next part on the concentration of the concentration of monopoly in banking and the new role that banks take on as the imperialist period comes to fruition, and the emergence of what we're calling finance capital. So obviously, as industrial capital becomes centralized and concentrated, we also see the same process go on in the financial sector, because they're involved in the same economy. They're just different types of capitalists, and they're crediting these industrial capitalists for their own development as well. So they are intertwined with this. The banks go from intermediaries for payments to enormous banks with enormous capital holdings that, like any capital, needs to find a profitable outing. And we see with the concentration of industry and the formation of banking monopolies, we see an essential alteration in the relation between banking and industry. Okay, alongside the enormous growth of industrial enterprises, the importance of large-scale, long-term credit that can be granted by banks to the industrial capitalists becomes equally as important. And the growth of these industrial capitalists relies on the bank's ability to provide credit for future growth. And simultaneously with this, we also see a large growth in the deposits in banks as well. So it's dialectically acting on one another. The growth of deposits and the ability to provide credit from the banks to the industrial capitalists is dialectically interacting with the industrial capitalists' necessity to grow in order to make enough profits to stay afloat and get more and more credit from the banks. So the most widespread form in which the banks began to invest in industry is through buying up shares in enterprises. Everyone in the modern day knows about that, buying shares in companies. And in this way, the banks facilitate the formation of enterprises into joint stock companies and corporations, as we know them today. And when banks finance a few large enterprises in a particular branch of industry, they become interested in monopolistic agreements as well. So they're, like I was saying before, in finance, monopolies are also developing, and this gives rise to a further concentration of capital. And so we see a merging of the interests of finance and industry, but not just a merging, but a subversion of industrial interests to the interests of finance. And because we're seeing that basically the industrial capitalists becoming reliant on the bank capitalists for credit. They need it in the monopoly capitalist period for growth. And what we see, this merger between industrial and bank capital with an industry subverted to the banks, this is what we call finance capital in monopoly capitalism. And as Lenin specifically described it in Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, he says the concentration of production, the monopolies arising therefrom, the merging or coalescence of the banks with industry, such is the history of the rise of finance capital, and such is the content of this term. So the coalescence of bank capital and industrial capital. And in the textbook, there was also an interesting part I took out because I wanted to read it word for word. It says the coalescence of bank capital with industrial capital is strikingly expressed in the personal union of the heads of the banking and industrial monopolies, the same people who head the largest monopoly associations in banking, industry, commerce, and the other branches of capitalist economy. So we see basically an oligarchy emerge, and that's what we saw in the textbook when it described monopoly capitalism as a financial oligarchy. We see these finance capitalists who own basically every huge swaths of the world economy, and they are leaders of banks and industry and commerce, and they have so much wealth and power that they're also able to influence elections. They're the ones these are the people financing the presidential campaigns, the politicians' campaigns. This is the way that the capitalists use the state for their own interests. And in every capitalist country, we see this, a handful of the biggest bankers and industrial monopolists holding in their grasp all of the vitally important branches of the economy and dispose of the overwhelming bulk of social wealth. This relation during imperialism, this relationship, it gives rise to the predominance as well of the export of capital, very different from the export of commodities that we saw before. And obviously there was capital exported in pre-monopoly capitalism, but it was not again, we can't interpret it mechanically. In monopoly capitalism, export of capital reaches its predominance in the system. As opposed to in pre-monopoly capitalism, where we saw a predominance of the export of commodities. So the export of capital, as described by the textbook, takes place in two forms: through loans to governments and by establishing industrial, commercial, or banking enterprises abroad. It's undertaken, obviously, for the purpose of obtaining higher profits, but it's also because the monopoly capitalists reach a point where they have no choice but to export capital, because we see an emergence of a superabundance of capital in developed capitalist countries, in which, we've been talking as well in other episodes about the crisis of overproduction in capitalism, that capitalism has a crisis where it produces too much. And in the developed capitalist countries at the monopoly capitalist period, we see this in a very acute form, this overproduction. We see, and the result is a superabundance of capital. And if it does not find profitable application, then we see an intensification, a very quick intensification of economic crises, an increase in their intensity, an increase in their frequency as well. So the way capitalists counterbalance this is by exporting capital as well. This capital is mainly exported to underdeveloped countries where everything is cheap and easily exploited. These are places where these monopoly capitalists can make monopoly profits, which is their goal. But it is also exported to other developed countries, more so when it's very profitable. For example, after a war, a developed country has a war, it's on the losing end. Capitalists from other countries are going to export capital there because it's going to be profitable. And this was a really interesting part of the textbook as well. It talked a little bit about how bourgeois economists try to depict capital export as like aid or developing the underdeveloped world. But the result is not the emergence of, other capitalist countries that are on the same level as these developed monopoly capitalist countries. These countries would become competitors to the monopolies that already exist. There's no reason they would want to create that, and they know that very well. What happens is that there's an acceleration of the development of capitalist relations in these countries, but under the conditions of peripheral subordination. Peripheral subordination, plunder, and economic enslavement to the monopolies, basically. So you see a development of capitalist relations in these countries where capital is exported to, but in a way that puts the country not at the center of the capitalist world system, but on the periphery and the side of the exploited. As a result of the export of capital, we see the world divided into a handful of usurer states and a gigantic majority of debtor states. I mean, we see that very clearly in, with the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and their relationship to the third world. I mean, they basically are the vehicles of debt enslavement. So this is so from here, I'm going to go on to the division of the world among the great powers. This is the next part of the textbook. And it's not just the division of the world among the great powers, but also the struggle to redivide it. Because capitalism divided the world actually a long time ago, over 100 years ago. And since then, there's been a struggle to redivide it. The developments we've discussed so far, they've led to basically within the capitalist system, an alliance of capitalist powers and the rest of the world encompassed in the system, which consists of colonies and semi-colonies and what we're calling dependent countries. So three types of peripheral units. And in political economy, we define them all a bit differently. Colonies are countries that are formally deprived of independence. They've become possessions of imperialist states. I mean, one example of this is Puerto Rico. You know, Puerto Rico is is American territory. It has no political rights at all. It's not part of the American people. Puerto Rico is a nation, and yet it has no autonomy. It's a colony. Semi-colonies are economically underdeveloped countries, which are objects of colonial exploitation, and they're economically dependent on capitalist imperialists, but they're not actually formally dependent. They're formally independent. So we're talking about like basically, I mean, we could say like, I guess Nigeria, you know, it's a formally independent country, but there's, you know, a very rich comprador capitalist class that gets rich off of collaborating with the Western monopolies that exploit its oil and other natural resources. That's another example. But there's also another fabric in the middle. And by the way, in this system, we're not talking about socialist states. That we'll get into later. The socialist states are outside of the capitalist system. But within the capitalist system, we have a third unit we call dependent countries. And this degree of dependence that they have varies from time to time. It's subject to change. And usually countries that we describe as dependent countries are actually politically independent. They actually have political independence de facto and de jure, but they're semi-financially dependent on the imperialists. And one example of this, I mean, the thing that comes to my mind really was basically Russia, before probably the special military operation began, you know. I mean, obviously, you know, Western sanctions are, you know, the Russian economy is not impervious to Western sanctions, but the Western sanctions are hurting the Russian economy to a certain degree because of the fact that there are, to a certain extent, ties to the international financial markets between the international financial markets that are dominated by Western powers and Russia. Although that's been significantly decreased over the past several years, especially after the crisis of 2015, to a point where Russia's, and this is what we're talking about when we talk about a degree of dependence that varies. Russia's dependence has significantly gone down since 2014 and 2015. So this is one example of that. And towards the beginning of the 20th century, we saw the colonial policies of the world's capitalist countries lead to a complete division of the world, as I mentioned before. They divided the world by means of colonial policies towards the beginning of the 20th century. And what comes after this are the imperialist wars we saw to redraw the world. And this is like what we've been dealing with since then. It doesn't mean every war that happens after this period is an imperialist war. That would be, again, a mechanical understanding of this. But for example, we're talking about the First World War, capitalist wars against, against each other. I mean, to a certain extent, World War II at the beginning could have been considered an imperialist war, but there's kind of a gray area because the Soviet Union was fighting a liberation war, but that could be all done in a different video. But anyway, so basically the basic economic law of monopoly capitalism, this we should define in this video. It's as defined actually by Stalin in Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR. as securing of the maximum capitalist profit through the exploitation, ruin, and impoverishment of the majority of the population of the given country, through the enslavement and systematic robbery of the peoples of other countries, especially backward countries, and lastly, through wars and militarization of the national economy, which are utilized for the obtaining of very high profits. We're going to basically pick apart that definition to define a lot of stuff that Stalin said there. But to start, we're going to talk about the law of surplus value, which is further developed under imperialism. And this is what gives rise to the difference we see between capitalists achieving average profit in pre-monopoly capitalism and monopoly capitalists achieving monopoly profits in imperialism. Because in pre-monopoly capitalism, we saw the average rate of profit be leveled off through competition, through free competition between individual capitalists, and the law of the average rate of profit prevailed. But now monopolies, the predominance of monopolies changes this, because monopolies have control. They have cornered markets. They can set prices as they wish, and they set it as high as they possibly can to make maximum profit. Maximum profit is and that's why maximum profit is now the driving force of capitalism, as opposed to the average rate of profit furnished through free competition. We see commodities produced by monopolies, we see them being sold at monopoly prices, much higher prices than they're really worth according to the price of production. And according to Marxist political economy, based on what we were talking about in the last video, actually, we remember that in pre-monopoly capitalism, the price of the commodity was the price of production plus its surplus, the price of the commodity plus the average rate of profit, the average profit given by the average rate of profit. But with monopoly prices, we see the price of these commodities being the price of production plus the maximum profit, which greatly exceeds average profit and yields monopoly profits. These are profits that are artificially made through artificially setting prices through monopoly control of markets. And to extract maximum profits, of course, as we know from the last video, as we know from Marxist political economy, profit comes from surplus value, and surplus value comes from the exploitation of the worker. So to achieve maximum profits, we see labor exploitation significantly intensified. I mean, this is why so many people feel like they're working so much harder right now than medieval peasants did, even though we're like super technologically advanced in relation to that period. Because even though technology has advanced so far since then, it's not being used to lighten the burden put upon the working class. It's used for the goal of achieving maximum profits. So it becomes a weapon that the capitalist class uses to further exploit as effectively as possible the surplus value of the working class around the world. And of course, the way they achieve these maximum profits, these monopoly profits, what are the main ways they do this? War and militarization of the economy. These are the main ways that they do that. And that's connected to the colonial system of imperialism. I want to go through a little bit what we mean when we talk about the colonial system of imperialism, because, a lot of capitalists, a lot of bourgeois economists, they say, oh, Lenin's definitions don't make any sense because empires existed far before capitalism. Colonialism existed during feudalism as well, but we have to be mindful of the definitions we're setting here, because Lenin specifically differentiates imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism from imperialist conquests of the slave era, for example, or the feudal era. These are different in their class character, and we have to understand that. And they differ in the sense that the role and significance of colonies undergo an essential change under capitalist imperialism. And that change is that the emergence of monopolies onto the world stage as they struggle for control of the sources of raw materials, they struggle for the maximum export of capital, for spheres of military and economic influence, it's under these conditions that we talk about capitalist imperialism, monopolies competing for colonial dominance around the world. We also see that national economies become links of a single chain that we call the world economy. This did not, the world economy did not exist until the emergence of capitalist relations. This is also another important thing to understand. And basically, we see, as I said before, with the exception of the socialist countries, we see the world divided into two camps. A small group of imperialist countries which exploit and oppress the colonial and dependent countries, and the vast majority of colonial and dependent countries on the other side. We see colonies becoming an agrarian and raw material appendage of imperialist countries. They become the sources of agricultural and raw material exploitation from the by the capitalist monopolies from the imperialist world. But another thing that the textbook doesn't mention that I wanted to add here, because of the fact, and this is because of the fact that the textbook is from 1954, it's a little outdated, but even now we can say that basically that colonies have also become appendages of labor exploitation themselves, because we don't only see now these colonies being exploited for their agricultural bounties or for the raw materials they have, but it has become possible since the 1980s and 1990s to outsource industrial labor. And this means that capitalist monopolies have now also been able to hyper-exploit industrial labor in third world countries, in their colonies or dependent countries as well. Now, how are colonies controlled in this system? They're usually not controlled by, some French guy with an army going in and telling them, what to do. It's almost always done through what we call the comprador bourgeoisie. In the peripheral capitalist countries, we always see a division within the bourgeoisie. We see the national bourgeoisie and the comprador bourgeoisie. The compradors are native middlemen that collaborate with the monopolies to profit from the plunder of their own country. So they're like collaborators, monopoly collaborators who facilitate the monopoly's business in this country, the exploitation of the country's labor, the country's raw resources, the country's agriculture, and the monopolies kick back to the comprador bourgeoisie a tiny, tiny fraction of the enormous profits that they bring from that. And still that tiny fraction is enough to make a lot of people in this small clique of comprador bourgeoisie very rich. And that's what, has them continuing to fulfill this class role. But we also have the national bourgeoisie, which is the other faction of the bourgeoisie, if you will, in the colonially oppressed countries. And they feel that they're oppressed by imperialism, and they're crowded out of political and economic power, and they attempt to exert themselves. Obviously, they're still the bourgeoisie. They're still interested in exploiting the working class, but when they are under imperialist bondage, their main goal is to combat that imperialist bondage under which they exist. They want to have political and economic power. But also we have other class interests, like the proletarian. It depends on the country. There are different levels of industrial development. A lot of times in national liberation struggles, the peasantry has been the main force behind it, but sometimes it's been the proletariat, depending on how developed industry is. And a lot of times in national liberation struggles, the national bourgeoisie can be a progressive force. They align themselves with the proletariat or with the peasantry to throw off the comprador bourgeoisie and the monopoly capitalists that are enslaving the country. So this is also important to understand. I'm not going to go too into the national liberation struggle of the colonial peoples, because it's a lot of history. If you like that, you can, go read it in the textbook. But I really want to cover the concepts that were gone over there, just because if we go through all the history, it's going to be way too long of a video. But basically, the main concept here is that the only way that people can free themselves from the burden of exploitation is a revolutionary struggle against imperialism. That's the only way that national liberation can take place. Already at the beginning of the 20th century, especially after the Russian Revolution, the first Russian Revolution of 1905 even, we saw the consciousness of the working masses of colonial independent countries awaken. We saw revolutionary movements across China, Korea, Persia, and Turkey, and they all basically fell into three categories, these colonial independent states. And this is kind of what I was talking about before. Some of these countries were completely unindustrialized, had no proletariat, and like, for example, in China, when Mao was fighting a civil war against Japanese imperialism, and then fought a liberation war against Japanese imperialism, and then a civil war against the capitalists. There was essentially no proletariat in China. They were very minuscule, and because of that, the peasantry was the class of revolutionary liberation in China. But that's not always the case. We also see two other categories in which countries have a comparatively small level of industry and somewhat of a proletariat, where we see, which I think we could really say that was Tsarist Russia in 1917, and when the revolution in 1917, and when they fought the civil war after, we saw an alliance of the industrial proletariat and the peasantry, because Russia was a semi-colonial country that was partially industrialized and had a significant proletariat, but still the vast majority of people in the country were peasants. So it wouldn't have been possible to have a revolution without the support of the peasantry. And then you have countries which are more or less developed along capitalist lines and have a large proletariat. They can be dependent as well. And I think the best example of that would have been like probably like Russia in the 1990s, because it had just been there had just been the capitalist re-emergence in Russia, and although huge deindustrialization took place as a result of that, there was not really a peasant class. It was the country was mainly proletarian at that point as well. Yeah, and also another thing I wanted to mention, when this textbook was written, it's because the textbook says that usually peasants are the peasants of the colonial world are almost always the revolutionary class in national liberation struggles. But again, I want to preface that by saying that that might be outdated. I mean, we should really, as an organization, as Center for Political Innovation, once we're more organized, we should do more theoretical research into this and make a determination through study and research. But I think that might not be the case anymore, because of the fact that after the 1980s and 1990s, vast majority, the huge swaths of what we consider the industrialized world had a massive amount of outsourcing of industrialized jobs to the third world. So the nature of imperialism kind of changed, and that requires further research. But just for your information, the textbook says the peasantry was basically the main, probably the main class of national liberation, and it definitely was throughout the 20th century. And lastly, I want to go through something I mentioned at the beginning of the video: the fact that imperialism, yes, it's the highest stage of capitalism. We see the highest stage of concentration and centralization of wealth in these massive monopolies. We see the extension of telecommunications across the planet. We see the concrete emergence of a world market. But at the same time, this is the beginning of the end for capitalism. It also, the emergence of imperialism also marks the beginning of its degradation. And this can be actually identified in several ways because of the fact that imperialism has a lot of parasitic, as well as it has a lot of characteristics that reflect parasitism and decay. So obviously monopolies, they dictate prices at artificially high levels, and they're not interested in introducing competitive technological innovations. That much is clear from the imperialist stage of society. That does not mean that there are not technological innovations, but we see them emerge very unevenly. And for example, like the thing I can think of is in science, for example. People joke a lot about how we still can't cure cancer, but there's so much money and advertisement and efforts going into treating male erectile dysfunction. This is like one example of the fact that this erectile dysfunction bit is very profitable and curing cancer is not. Because you want to know what? It's a lot more profitable to treat cancer as a process rather than actually cure it. And that's just a reality of monopoly capitalism. This is an example of the obstruction of technological innovation and progression that is caused during this period. Some of the strategies that are employed to do this are like planned obsolescence, where companies literally make products not as good as they could possibly be because they plan to make them obsolete after a certain period so that consumers have to buy more, even though they could have made a product that was much better, but it wouldn't be as profitable. This is basically an impediment to technological innovation. And also, we also see this with the fact that companies release products that are not of the highest quality possible because they want to release further updates that are going to cost money. This is another thing. And all this, these are just several examples that lead to the hindering of technological progress and basically stagnation. We can also characterize this period as parasitic because of the fact that the capitalist class in the monopoly capitalist period loses its connection with the process of production. I mean, at least in the pre-capitalist period, right? Obviously, capitalists still exploited the labor of the workers, like the capitalist was in an exploitative privileged position, but they still had a direct relation to production in the pre-monopoly period. The predominant company was basically one guy who owned a factory or a couple factories. This was the predominant, idea that we have of a capitalist in the pre-monopoly period. But at this point in monopoly capitalism, the person who owns these factories is far removed from the actual productive process. They are somewhere in a bank, or like somewhere completely disconnected from the productive process that's going on in that factory they own. So much so that they don't even go to the factory. They hire management to take care of the processes, the managerial processes that the capitalists undertook in pre-monopoly capitalism. So in this sense, we see the emergence of a parasitic relationship between capitalists and the process of production. We also see the transformation of the character of landlords and capitalists. They basically become rentiers. They become people who live on income from company holdings and securities. They not only don't need to work for a living, which is the definition of a capitalist, someone who doesn't need to work for a living because they live off their capital holdings in a capitalist society. Not only do they do that, but they live off the company holdings and securities and don't even have to serve managerial functions. So this is one aspect of one parasitic aspect. Another parasitic aspect is also actually the growth of militarism. And the reason we call this parasitic is because war serves no productive function. And yet, as monopoly capitalism continues to develop, we see increasing amounts of money taken from working people's incomes in the form of taxes for the unproductive purpose of maintaining huge armies and preparing for imperialist wars. The United States is the perfect example of that. It has there's already for next year the national security budget is supposed to be around 800 somewhere in the $800 billion range. There's several proposals already, but the last one I saw was between 850 and 860 $1 billion. That's like incredible. That's more than the next 8 well-funded the next 8 strongest, most well-funded armies in the world combined. So this is what we talk about. Like, you could just look at the United States when you want to, if you want to see the epitome of monopoly capitalist parasitism. We also see, I'm going to go through some side notes here about this. We also see the growth of opportunism, the adaptation of labor leaders and people who call themselves socialists, who are calling for reforming or improving capitalism and lead the working class nowhere, even though things have to be changed revolutionarily. We also see, obviously, intensifying contradictions between labor and capital, and this is why this period precedes socialist revolution. There was also a bit of a part about state monopoly capitalism. I'm just going to go over that quick. It's because it's important to understand that the state machine in imperialist countries is nothing more than a tool of capitalist monopolies to do 2 things. One, to interfere in the country's economy on the behalf of the monopolies, in 2008 to bail out the banks that created the financial crisis in the first place, and number 2, to wage war, like we were talking about before. And it's important to understand that state regulation of the economy is carried out in the interests of monopoly capitalists, and it cannot eliminate the anarchy of capitalists, the anarchy of capitalist production, or the economic crises that lead, or the further further deepening contradictions of the capitalist system, as we hear from social democrats and democratic socialists who were saying that capitalism can be reformed into socialism. It's not possible. Just some last side notes here. There was a little bit about the fact about the law of uneven economic and political development of capitalist countries during the period of imperialism. It's important to understand that countries develop even more unevenly during monopoly capitalism than they did under pre-monopoly capitalism. And we see a general crisis of capitalism emerge, basically. It can be described, it can be characterized by wars and revolutions, by a struggle between moribund capitalism and growing socialism. It involves an ever more intense disintegration of the world capitalist system, from which more and more countries are falling away, and the growing economic might of those which have already fallen away. Lenin pointed out that the general crisis of capitalism is not an event which takes place in a single moment of time either. This is really important to understand, because after reading that last sentence, you might think, oh, well, the Soviet Union collapsed. Socialism is way on the back foot in comparison to the 20th century. That's true, but obviously historical development works in periods of, in revolutionary periods and reactionary periods. And nothing's really, personally, I don't really share the optimism of the socialists of the 20th century that say that socialism is inevitable. I think it's inevitable if capitalism doesn't destroy us first, but that's also a possibility. So, so we're talking about the general crisis of capitalism, not as an event that takes place in a single moment of time, but through a long period of stormy economic and political upheavals and sharp class struggles. So this is, a historical epoch. It's not one event. And one of the biggest flashpoints of this, of course, was the First World War, which gave rise to socialist revolutions around the world. And after World War II, we also saw the single capitalist world market broken up, and we saw a split into the socialist world and the capitalist world. And we still kind of see that today, but in a different way, on a smaller scale. Obviously, socialist countries are far less in number these days, but we also have like the emergence of the Eurasian alternative to Western capitalism. And although they're connected to, they're kind of like they're countries that are connected to the international system, but they're historically considered the periphery, and they're not taking up the role that capitalist imperialist countries have taken in throughout the 20th century that we've seen. So this is another interesting thing. All this could use even more theoretical development and everything, which I think eventually, after we read this textbook, Center for Political Innovation should take up the task of doing. But we could talk about that more later. But that is the end of this episode 4 on monopoly capitalism, imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Do you guys have any questions, or you wanted to add anything?
Hey, I'll just add, they did bring up a few times about the emergence of fascism or emergence of some kind of illiberal tendency. And I'll just read the quote here. It's in the second to last chapter of this section, towards the end of that section. He kind of defines fascism. He says, fascism is the open terrorist dictatorship of the most reactionary and aggressive elements of finance capital. Fascism sets itself the aims internally of smashing the organizations of the working class and crushing all progressive forces, and externally of preparing and launching a war of conquest for domination of the world. Fascism seeks to realize these aims by methods of terror and social demagoguery. So I just thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's a good definition. Yeah, thanks for adding that.
Yeah, and he talks about it a few other times. And I think that's important to think about, because I think that might be emerging again in some kind of new form today.
Yeah, definitely.
Some other thoughts I had that I wish were mentioned was the IMF and the World Bank and the Bretton Woods Agreement, which all happened before this book was published. So I was just curious, maybe your thoughts on why that was excluded. I was kind of thinking maybe they were just kind of started at that time and they weren't as influential until after the 70s.
Yeah, that would be my guess as well. Because back then, they didn't have as much influence as they do now, especially after the collapse of the USSR. But even in the 1970s, it became a big deal.
I guess as I was reading this chapter, I was kind of thinking throughout how the nature of imperialism has changed. And I think that's an important aspect of it. And the fact that the US dollar hegemony was so strong after World War II, that changed something, and the deindustrialization. I can see it as a process of the definition of imperialism, but I feel like something has changed that we need to articulate.
Yeah, I definitely think so as well. I mean, now that we're talking about it, what I wanted to do after this book, after we finished reading this book, was to develop and modernize this textbook so that we can use it and apply it to a modern context. Because there's a lot of things like that need to be added. Because imperialism, like we were talking about throughout this this Zoom call, as you mentioned, the character of imperialism has significantly changed since 100 years ago. I mean, now, that's what we even live in a world, in a Western world, where people are calling it like deindustrialized. Obviously, I don't know. I don't think that definition would be entirely accurate, but there's a reason people are saying that, and that's because labor has become just as exploitable in the third world as raw materials and agricultural products were in the 20th century, when back then that was not possible. It was not possible to export industrial jobs or outsource them. And this is something that requires serious theoretical analysis, I think, because the repercussions of it are very, very significant. I mean, we understand the working class to be the most revolutionary class that society has ever seen, and there are concrete reasons for that. Specifically, the socialization of labor, the fact that the industrial proletariat works basically in mass in centralized factories where they communicate with one another and everything. And yet we've seen a massive outsourcing of that nature of labor, and we've seen the development of a gig economy, which is actually very counterproductive to the organization of labor and the organization of revolutionary movements, because people are treated in the capitalist system as individual proprietors, when in reality they're working on like an industrial proletarian level. I mean, like Uber is a perfect example of this, you know, like they're like wage slaves, but they are packaged as individual proprietors, and that is a big problem for the revolutionary movement. This is a bunch of stuff like that. We definitely need to decide to put together a project and update this textbook to be in accordance with these current realities that were not around during the time of Lenin. So, which is exactly what Lenin did with Marx's works, you know?
Yeah.
kind of on that point, with the whole discourse lately on like service labor versus like proletarian labor that's kind of been going on, does that kind of relate to, I guess, kind of gig economy condition you mentioned that's pretty different from conditions of the past, and trying to apply these kind of ideas? Yeah, I guess gig economy, service worker, like the big thing has been like coffee baristas, Starbucks employees, and like, can you really treat service workers the same way you do as people that work on a farm, or I don't know, like truckers, or people that produce commodities?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how does that?
Well, yeah, I think think they have like the character of their social organization and labor is a little bit different than industrial workers. I mean, definitely for the gig economy, hands down, but even service workers, you know, because usually service workers, we're talking about a lot of times we're talking about part-time workers, you know, and in and out people that come to work for a little while and leave. And that's not always the case. There are a lot of people who obviously work at places like McDonald's or any service industry. They've worked there for many years because they have to feed their family that way. But they're not the overwhelming majority, like was the case when the industrial working class was, you know, a lot larger in the United States. So that presents a problem as well. I mean, these all present barriers and obstacles to, you know, traditional union organizing. So.
Right.
But again, after we finish the textbook, we should talk about all this further and develop some sort of new theories if we can.
Yeah, very interesting stuff here. I thought I had another question, but I think I lost it. But
that's all right.
It's okay. I can put it in the chat later if I
all right, cool.
do it again.
All right.
Another aspect or a manifestation of these changes would be the decline in the labor aristocracy. And this textbook kind of says that the labor aristocracy and industrialized workers will continue to grow in these imperialist countries, but as we've seen, that's changed rapidly in the past few decades.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, we could it'd be cool to see to issue some corrections where predictions weren't all that correct in this textbook. It's incredible that so much in this textbook is still actually relevant, on the other hand, like because it was written in 1954, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, Ryan, talking about fascism actually like reminds me exactly how people respond to like the Ukraine like propaganda and stuff, and like the techniques they've been using to kind of get people to think a certain way. Because like even personally, I have like people who were friendly before, but Ukraine has kind of had like a pretty strong impact on like how they interact with people these days. So even in my family too, like the social demagogy aspect of fascistic control. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's just like one thing I noticed particular for right now. And I'm sure Taiwan's going to be another avenue for that.
Big time. Yeah, being in Russia right now, definitely the Ukraine conflict. Well, I haven't lost that many friends, to be honest. Actually,
Oh yeah.
yeah, actually, I was always friends with like radical people, so they're like, yeah, and my family supports me, so it's all good.
Oh yeah,
But
my family and friends are pretty liberal, so some of them kind of will. I don't try to push it too hard, but they are a little hostile towards anything anti-Ukraine or anti-Western intelligence.
yeah, I lost all my liberal friends after I
Oh
started
yeah.
working.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. But whatever. I wasn't that thrilled about them anyway.
Yeah.
But anyway, guys, it's getting kind of late, so I'm going to cut it short now.
Oh right. Yes.
Hour, so that's pretty great. And we went over a lot of important points. I'm happy to see that you guys are like engaging with the material in this way, seeing the same kind of things that I was thinking about when I read this textbook for the first time. Like it's a really great textbook, but it needs some serious theoretical updating. And we need like great Marxist thinkers of our time, Marxist-Leninist thinkers, as there were in times past. And I think Center for Political Innovation could be the think tank to do that. So, all right.
Yeah, agreed.
All right, guys. Well, thanks for watching, comrades. If you're watching the recording, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to this video, and check out the rest of the episodes for the political economy series and Workers of the World Unite.
Thanks, son.